So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 39.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
All right, so the last time that we saw Joseph, he was being led away from his brothers, and they were laughing, and they were dividing their 20 pieces of silver, the price of his slavery. So Joseph, who had been disrobed and beaten and bruised, he begins this life of slavery. And on this road, he travels toward Egypt, and he's taking care of the camels, and now he's loading and unloading them because he's going to be doing all the menial work to be done, taking care of these Ishmaelites, who are his cousins. And Joseph, he would have been able to understand their speech because their language would have been similar to his, because they were all sons of Abraham. And Joseph, he would have been bound in some way so that he wouldn't run off. So he may have like a rope around his neck. They might be having him walk behind the camels. And Egypt, it wasn't a short trip. It was 459 miles away. And it would have taken a minimum of 10 days. And that's if Joseph was allowed to ride a camel. But it was probably more like 18 days, because if they made about 25 miles a day, which was about the average distance somebody would travel, and they didn't do any other type of business on the way to Egypt. And so now they're traveling, and as they travel farther south, Joseph would have noticed the landscape beginning to change, because it would be different. Because Egypt at this time was a land of small villages, and it was filled with peasant farmers who would have been raising grain and vegetables by their irrigation systems they had, by the flooding of the Nile. And these people, they wouldn't have lived in tents. They lived in houses that were made out of bricks. And their more important buildings, they would have been made out of stone. And though it was mostly villages, there was a couple cities, and one of them would have been On, which is known as Hierapolis, and then there would have been another city called Memphis, and that's not the one you find in Tennessee. And these Egyptians, they had over 2,000 gods, and one of them would have been the Pharaoh himself. And this was a land of superstitions. And the Egyptians, they were dedicated to the things of death just as much as they were dedicated to the things of life in the worship of their gods. And these Ishmaelite traders, they would have gone to the city where the Pharaoh lived, because that's where they would have got the greatest demand for their goods. And their goods were mostly spices and balms and myrrhs, because we read that in the last chapter. But this time, they would also have a slave to sell. And in Egypt, there would have been a lot of Semonite slaves like Joseph. And so he would have been taken down to the slave market, and he would have been naked or nearly naked. And the interested buyers, they would have come and they would have poked him and they would have prodded him like they were buying a horse or a mule or like trying to buy a used car, because they would want to see how much they would be able to get out of him. How much labor could they get? Would it be cost effective for his service? And so they would have checked his teeth to see if any of them were missing, and they would have looked for any type of physical injuries or any type of abnormalities. And now from Joseph's perspective, it would be hard for him to see that God was still leading him in his life, because this doesn't seem much like the dreams he had of his brothers bowing down to him. And naturally, he would have had some doubts. But God, he is leading his life, because God is teaching Joseph how to be a slave and how to be a servant. And if you've read anything about the history of Egypt, you would know that Egyptians treated their slaves harshly. And Joseph, he could have been sold to anybody, And he could have been used for anything, any type of labor. But Joseph was sold to Potiphar. And I believe that Potiphar, his first name was Harry. He was Harry Potter-fur. But really, Potiphar means devoted to the sun. So this man, Potiphar, he had a great suntan. And in those days, they had no tanning booths and they had no spray tans. But like many today, he was a suntanner and he was devoted to the sun. But Potiphar, he was also devoted to Pharaoh. Potiphar was Pharaoh's captain of the guards. And the idea behind being the captain of the guards is like being the chief of police. He was in charge of Pharaoh's personal security force. And like all the officers of the Pharaoh, the word officer is synonymous with the word eunuch. Because these men being altered like that, they would have been made exclusively dedicated to Pharaoh to do his work. They would have no other desires to do anything else but to serve their master. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Potiphar was a eunuch, because this term was also used for everyone that was in Pharaoh's court. And these terms were used interchangeably. And so by God's grace, Joseph has been placed into this great man's household. And although Joseph doesn't understand God's path for him, Joseph, he doesn't abandon God, and God doesn't abandon him. And this reminds me of how the Apostle Paul, well, how he was told that he would speak before kings, but God just didn't tell him the part that he would be doing it as a prisoner of Rome. And so Joseph, he settles down into this household, and God prospers Joseph. And Joseph's master, well, he likes him, and he sees the great potential in this young man. And you have to remember, Joseph, when he got there, he was only 17 years old. And the more Joseph is given to do, the more he succeeds. And even Potiphar acknowledges that it's the Lord, that the Lord is with him. And so Potiphar, he keeps giving Joseph more and more responsibility, and he puts him in charge of the whole household. And you do get that sense that Potiphar, that he really likes this young foreigner that he bought. And you'd think that he was watching Joseph and he brought him home and he sees this Hebrew and he's just learning to speak Egyptian, and he spoke with this Hebrew accent. And even though he was a slave, Potiphar may have thought of him more as like a protege, or maybe even like some type of adopted son, because maybe Potiphar wasn't able to have sons if he was a eunuch. And if that's so, that might be all there was in that household. Might have been only slaves and Mrs. Potiphar. And Joseph being placed as the head of all the household, and it says that he was also over all the fields, which means that he would have been over Potiphar's investments, all his agriculture, his crops, and maybe there was even some herds. And if Joseph was over those activities, he already had some experience from his father's house. But this would have been a much bigger enterprise because of the kind of man that Potiphar was. So Joseph here, he's getting quite an education. And he's not only getting an education of how Egypt works, but he's also getting an education in how it is to act in a royal household, how to act around royalty and around politicians, and how to serve them and how to speak to them. And he's learning how they think because he's listening to all their conversations, and he's learning their customs, their etiquette, down to the little practical things of what side of the plate to put the silverware on, and who do you serve first. And all these things that common Egyptians, the regular citizens, that they wouldn't know. And this is probably the only way that somebody from the outside would have gotten this kind of education, by observing them and by practicing it every day, day after day, until it becomes second nature to him, until he becomes comfortable in all these ways. And so Joseph, he became a great servant to Potiphar. And now Joseph, he might be thinking here in his meditations and in his prayer, okay, Lord, I see what you're doing. You're making me into someone great. You're teaching me how to be successful and how things actually work in the real world. Okay, I can see how those dreams you gave me might, fit in here. And this whole time, even when Joseph didn't understand, he trusted God and he believed God and he walked with God and he still believed that those dreams that he had were from God. But through most of it, no one would have ever have been able to make sense of it. But now it seems like it's coming together and it's starting to make sense. And Joseph, he wasn't in that household for just a little while. He was there for up to 11 years. And the kind of things that he was learning, they would take that kind of time. And toward the end of Joseph's stay in Potiphar's house, Joseph would have been around 28 years old because he started there when he was 17. And now we're told that Joseph was very handsome and he was actually called beautiful. And the Bible only calls 2 adult men beautiful besides Joseph, and that was King David and that was his son Absalom. And so you have this young man and he's walking around the house like Brad Pitt in his prime. And he speaks fluent Egyptian with all the sophistication of a Cary Grant. And he's a well-dressed man. In fact, he's a perfectly dressed man. Because he has to be, because of the type of people that they entertained in that home. Because they were Pharaoh's people. They were the elite. They were the people who ruled Egypt. But all Mrs. Potiphar can do is stare at Joseph and drool with desire for him, because he was way better looking than all the actors in the Egyptian soap operas back then. And she's totally infatuated with him. But she has a real problem because she's a married woman. And Mrs. Potiphar being married to Mr. Potiphar, well, that wasn't really doing it for her, because it's not the way it is in her dream life. That's not what she wanted when she was laying around on her couch daydreaming all day, because she was young and she was very attractive. She was like Angelina Jolie or maybe a Jennifer Aniston. And she, in her dreams, can see herself with a man like Joseph. Because you see, Mr. Potiphar, he may or he may not be a eunuch, but one thing we do know about Mr. Potiphar is that he's older, because you wouldn't be captain of the guard without a lot of experience. And so he was probably craggy, and he was rough, and he was tough, and he was kind of like dirty Harry Potter. And he was a warrior. And he was actually a warrior of warriors. He was like special forces, except he's more like a general. So maybe he looked more like John Wayne in True Grit. And maybe he has scars and a patch over one of his eyes and leathery skin. Maybe a couple of his teeth have been knocked out. But there's one thing that's true about powerful men. No matter how they look, they always have beautiful wives. They have trophy wives. So day after day, Angelina Jolie, she's saying to Joseph, Joseph, can't you come sit with me over here on the couch? And Joseph would say, Mrs. Potiphar, I'm only up here to bring up the towels. And Angelina would say, Joseph, just love me. And this went on for years and years. And it wasn't because she wasn't beautiful, because she was. But he couldn't do it, because he believes that God has something better for him. Because he knows that if he commits this sin, and this is obvious sin, because this is adultery, that God wouldn't be able to use him in the way that God wanted to use him, and he would lose his great calling. And Joseph, he wouldn't trade that for anything. So Joseph, he never acted on this and he never encouraged it. And he explains it very well to her. He says that he couldn't because of his love for God. But that doesn't mean that Joseph wasn't tempted. I'm sure he was, because he was a normal young man. And he could have gotten away with it in the sight of men. But he knew that he would never get away with it in the sight of God, because he really believes in God. And that's why God can use him. And that's why God can lead him. And that's why God can even trust him in this place. So loving God is Joseph's first reason not to sin. But Joseph has a second reason not to sin, and that's because Joseph loves Potiphar. Because Potiphar, he gave him everything. When Joseph had absolutely nothing, Potiphar saved Joseph's life. Though it was actually God saving Joseph through Potiphar, but it's just like how God had saved Joseph from being murdered by his brothers through those Ishmaelite slave traders. And what Joseph thought was destroying him was actually God saving him. And so one day, Mrs. Potiphar, she's not going to take it anymore, because her heart has been given over to this act of sin for a long time now. And she's planned it. She's not going to let Joseph reject her any longer, because he's just a slave. And she tells herself, and he's my slave too. And so she sends everyone out of the house on errands. And the way I see it, when she sends the last servant out, she says something like, "Oh, and on your way out, can you send Joseph up here with some more towels?" But she doesn't want towels. And so she grabs Joseph by the robe and she starts pulling him toward her. And she tells him something like, "You might look great, but you're just a slave, and you'll do what I tell you." And as she pulls his robe toward her, he slips out of it. And it's not like Joseph ran through the house naked. Mrs. Potiphar grabbed his outer robe. Joseph still had on his linen undergarment. And this is the second time that Joseph has been wrongly stripped of his robe. The last time it was by his brothers to deceive their father, but this time it's by an adulterous woman to try to deceive her husband. And it probably didn't come to her right away. And she's just probably sitting there for a moment, and she's holding Joseph's robe, and she's mad, and she's been rejected again. And she thinks, well, how am I going to explain why I have Joseph's robe? And he's already outside, and you wonder if any of the other servants had seen him running out, if there was any kind of time lapse, if there was any kind of pause. And then you hear Mrs. Potiphar scream, oh men, get in here, look at this." And now Mrs. Potiphar, she's sitting there on her couch, and her clothes are all disheveled and her hair's all messed, and she's smeared her makeup. And the very first thing she points out to them is that Joseph, well, he's a foreigner, and that it was her husband Potiphar who put this foreigner in charge of them. And so she's appealing to the other servants' envy of Joseph's position, because she's trying to get them to back up her lies and add credibility to her story. And she says, "He came in here to mock me." And Mrs. Potiphar, she's holding on to Joseph's robe that whole day until her husband comes home. And then she repeats to him the same story. But this time, she blames Potiphar. She says, "It's your fault, Potiphar." And the adulteress, well, she blames her husband. And she says, "The Hebrew you brought into us, you did it." So she allies herself with these other servants, and she says, calling them us. So she includes herself with the servants. And then we read that Potiphar, his anger's aroused. But what we don't read here is that how Potiphar, he had to send out a search party to find Joseph, or how he had to chase Joseph down as a runaway slave. Because I believe that Joseph, he was just still waiting outside. because he's waiting to see how things are going to play out because he did nothing wrong. He's innocent. And Potiphar is so mad. You would wonder, well, why didn't Potiphar just kill him? Because I'm sure Potiphar was in a position where he had killed lots of men before. And it would have been legal because Joseph was just property. He was a slave. And he's not being accused of just taking a few extra cookies at lunch. He's being accused of rape. And it's the rape of Potiphar's wife. And even being so angry, Potiphar, he knows Joseph's character because he's known him for a long time. And Potiphar, he knows his wife's character, and she's probably lied to him before. And so it seems that Potiphar, he may not have really believed her. But she did have Joseph's robe, and he had to do something. And it could be Potiphar really did believe Joseph here, but it's also very possible that Potiphar also beat Joseph here, trying to get a confession from him, because being a cop, cops can usually tell when someone's lying to them, because this makes absolutely no sense for Potiphar to put Joseph as a slave into prison for the rape of one of Pharaoh's officers' wives, because that would have been a capital crime. And some ancient rabbis taught that Mrs. Potiphar spoke to her husband to spare Joseph, to have him put in prison so she could take advantage of him later. But to me, that's not really likely, but who knows? But it's right here at the highest point of Joseph's career where he can almost see what God is doing toward the fulfillment of his calling and the dreams that he'd been given, where these dreams just started to make sense again. And then it all comes crashing down. And he's worse off than when his brothers sold him into slavery. Because now he's a prisoner for life, which is worse than being a slave. Because how much more freedom can you be stripped of? So Joseph, he's humbled again. And all his dreams die again. But God's working, because you see, God had to move Joseph out of Potiphar's house. And God has already taught Joseph everything he needed to learn in that house. But God, he has so much more to teach him to become the man that he's calling him to be. And how would Joseph ever be released from Potiphar and be removed from Potiphar's house? Potiphar was never going to set Joseph free. Joseph was way too valuable. And if you really think about it, it's Potiphar who has the greatest loss here, because now he has to go home and he has to run his own household, and he's still stuck with his adulterous wife. And you might want to think here, well, it really didn't turn out that bad for Joseph. You know, Potiphar probably believed him, and it looks like Potiphar put a good word in for him, because now Joseph's running the whole prison. And you might want to think that. But that's not true, because that's not how it happened. And even though Joseph is innocent of all those charges, and even if Potiphar does believe him, Joseph is not only accused of rape, but he's convicted.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,